There are women who refuse the world quietly, who fold their refusals into polite silences and grateful smiles. And then there are women like Vivienne Whitmore, who read a legal notice on horseback in a muddy lane and feel something close to pleasure at having been given a reason to fight. The morning Lord Crale's notice arrived at Ashfin. The ink was barely dry when she rode out to the boundary, the paper rattling against her coat, her horse picking its way through the October mud with considerably more patience than its rider. She had built 12 years of careful independence on this land. Her father's land, her land now. And she had done it without a husband and without apology. And she was not about to lose a water right to a man who had never once looked at a primary source in his life. What she had not anticipated on that particular morning was the Duke of Mornington arriving from the opposite direction on a better horse, with the bearing of a man accustomed to documents being brought to him, and looking at her as though she were something he had not been asked to account for before. The lane ran along the eastern edge of Ashfin, at the point where the property met the old Crale boundary, marked by a low stone wall so ancient it had settled into the earth at an angle, as though it had made its peace with gravity long ago. Vivienne had pulled her horse to a halt and was reading the legal notice for the third time, holding it slightly away from the wind, when she heard hooves coming from the north. The Duke of Mornington was 38, broad-shouldered without being ostentatious about it, and riding with the loose ease of a man who has never had to think about how he looked on horseback, because he had always looked perfectly well. He drew up at a distance that was neither too close nor too far, and regarded her with a frank curiosity that stopped just short of impertinence. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Vivienne said, without looking up from the document. He waited. When she did not volunteer anything further, he said, "I am James Albright, the Duke of Mornington." "I know who you are," Vivienne said. She folded the top half of the notice down and looked at him directly. "Are you here about the water right?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but the adjustment a man makes when a conversation does not begin the way he had arranged it in his head. "I am here to make you a reasonable offer," he said. Vivienne tucked the legal notice into the inner pocket of her coat, smoothed the lapel flat, and looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention she reserved for documents that required translation. "What do you consider reasonable," she said, "for something that is not for sale?" The Duke of Mornington had not been refused anything, not in any material sense, since the year 1803, when a bay hunter at a Newmarket sale had sold to another bidder before his agent arrived. He had resolved that situation within a fortnight. He had the strong impression that this situation would take somewhat longer, and the expression on his face in that moment was one that had not been on it before. Not offended, not amused, but genuinely uncertain what to do next. Vivienne did not wait for him to decide. She turned her horse and rode back toward Ashfin. The notice itself, read in full at the library desk with a glass of cold water and her father's magnifying lens, was worse than she had expected in its specificity, and better than she had feared in its actual legal standing. Lord Crale was claiming a prescriptive right over the mill pond and the upper drainage channel on the grounds that his grandfather's estate had exercised uninterrupted use of, both for 60 years prior to the current boundary arrangement. The claim was supported by a covenant he described as dating to 1761. Vivienne had never seen this covenant. More importantly, she had spent the better part of 3 years cataloging her father's complete archive of land records, and she had never encountered a single reference to it. She wrote to her solicitor, Mr. Henshaw, in London, and she did not moderate her language. She told him the claim was constructed from nothing, that she required every historical record pertaining to the Ashfen water right within the fortnight, and that if he had been aware of any outstanding claim on this property and had failed to advise her, she would want to know why before she decided what to do about it. She sealed the letter, gave it to her housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, to send with the morning post, and sat for a moment at the desk with her pen against her teeth, tapping slowly. The Duke of Mornington's note arrived that afternoon. It was short and unornamented, which surprised her. She had expected charm and received directness instead. He wrote that he had a body of historical documentation pertaining to the Ashfen water right and the surrounding land grants that might be of use to her, and that he would welcome the opportunity to discuss the matter at her convenience. She read it twice. Then she wrote back a single line. Thursday, 2 o'clock, Ashfen. She did not add anything about looking forward to it, because she was not certain that was true, and she had a long-standing policy against writing things she was not certain of. He arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, which she had not expected from a man with a reputation for arriving when he chose. Mrs. Peel showed him into the library, and Vivienne was already at the table with 3 stacks of documents sorted by date, a pen in her hand, and a written counter-proposal in a separate folder, which she slid across the table before he had fully sat down. "Before we discuss terms," she said, "I want you to read that." The Duke settled into the chair across from her, picked up the counter-proposal, and read it without comment. He read it the way she had hoped he would read it, carefully from the beginning, without skipping to the conclusion. "You are proposing a joint legal defense," he said. "I am proposing a formal alliance against Lord Crale's claim," Vivienne said. "He is using your boundary to anchor his argument, which means his claim, if it succeeds, damages your title to the eastern drainage channel as well as my water right. You have as much reason to contest it as I do." The Duke set the counter-proposal down. "I had planned to purchase the water right from you," he said, "outright, at a price that would represent a considerable improvement on its assessed value." "I know," Vivienne said. "And if you had arrived 6 months ago, I might have been interested in discussing it. But Crale's notice changes the calculation. If I sell to you now, I sell under legal duress, and the price reflects that. If we defend the claim together and win, I keep the water right, you keep the drainage channel, and Crale loses both. And if we lose, then we were going to lose anyway, individually. At least this way we share the legal costs and the documentary burden." She paused. "Do you read Latin?" The Duke looked at her. "I do." "Good," Vivienne said, "because 2 of the earliest land grants are in ecclesiastical Latin, and my solicitor's translation of the second one is wrong in a way that materially affects the argument." She stood and moved to the far end of the table where the oldest documents were laid flat under a sheet of clean linen. "I need a second opinion before I put it in front of a magistrate." He came and stood beside her. They were close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, not intrusively, but as a fact, the way you are aware of a fire when you have been cold. She lifted the linen sheet and pointed to the relevant passage. He read. He read it again. He said, "Your solicitor has translated aqua currens as running water in the general sense. But in this context, look at the surrounding clauses. It refers to a specific defined channel. It is a proper noun, effectively." "That is what I thought," Vivienne said, "which changes the boundary description entirely." "Yes." He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "How long have you been working on this?" "Since Thursday morning, when the notice arrived," Vivienne said. "The same day you rode up to offer me a reasonable price for something that is not for sale." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the precursor to one, stopped by some quality of her attention that made performing it feel unnecessary. "All right," he said. "Show me the second document." They worked for 2 hours at the library table. They disagreed twice. Once about the significance of a boundary marker described in the 1748 survey, and once about whether a particular witness signature constituted legal endorsement of the water right or merely acknowledgement of the boundary. Both times, Vivienne was correct. Both times, the Duke acknowledged it without deflecting, without making a joke, without producing the social machinery that men in his position usually employed when a woman knew more than they did. She noticed this. She did not remark on it. By 4 o'clock, they had agreed on the outline of a joint legal strategy. The alliance was formal, documented in a brief memorandum of understanding that Vivienne drafted on the spot and both of them signed. It was built entirely on mutual legal necessity and mutual irritation. Irritation at Lord Crale. Irritation at the inadequacy of the existing documentary record, and a low, productive friction between two people who both had strong opinions about Latin translation and were not accustomed to being contradicted. The Duke left at 4:30. At the door he paused, and she thought for a moment he was going to say something personal, something charming, something she would have to be on guard against. He said, "The 1761 Covenant Crale is citing. I have not seen it in any of the Mornington Hall records. Not a reference, not a copy, nothing." "Nor have I," Vivienne said. "That is interesting," the Duke said. "Yes," Vivienne agreed. "It is." He left. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the lane where the mud was already beginning to freeze at its edges in the October cold. And then she went back to the library and picked up her pen. Lord Crale filed with the county magistrate on the following Monday and obtained a hearing date 6 weeks away. The notice arrived at Ashfen on Tuesday morning, and at Mornington Hall, Vivienne assumed, sometime before noon. She was correct. The Duke's note arrived at 2 o'clock. "Crale has accelerated. We should work through the archive systematically, every evening if you can manage it." Vivienne wrote back, "Every evening. Start with the Mornington Hall estate records from 1740 to 1770. I will bring the Ashfen equivalents." She gave the note to her groom, and then sat for a moment at the desk, rereading what she had written. The word nightly had been in her head as she wrote, and she had chosen every evening instead, which was the same thing said differently, and she did not examine why she had made the substitution. When she wrote to Mr. Henshaw to update him on the situation, she told him she and the Duke had agreed to work through the historical archive together each evening. And she wrote the word nightly without thinking, and then she looked at it, and she left it. She was not going to change a word because it sounded like something it was not. She was 34 years old, and she had a hearing in 6 weeks, and she had work to do. The evening sessions at Ashfen began on Wednesday. The Duke arrived at 6. Mrs. Peel brought a lamp and a pot of tea that no one touched while it was hot, and they worked until 9 or 10. By the third evening, they had established a rhythm. She catalogued and sorted. He cross-referenced against the Mornington Hall records he had brought in a leather satchel, and they compared findings every hour or so in the manner of two people who had been doing this for years. On the third evening, he found a reference in a 1743 estate ledger to a document concerning the water boundary, rolled it, and passed it across the table to her. Their fingers did not touch. There was precisely 1 inch of air between his hand and hers. She was aware of the measurement with an exactness that had nothing to do with surveying. And she took the document and unrolled it and read it, and she picked up her pen with slightly more force than the task required, and she did not look up. Outside, the November rain had begun in earnest against the library windows, a steady percussion against the glass that made the lamplight feel more concentrated, the table more particular, the space between them more defined. She was not going to think about it. She had 11 documents to cross-reference before midnight, and Lord Crale had a hearing date, and she was going to think about that. Over 11 evenings of work, it became clear to Vivienne that the Duke was considerably more useful than she had anticipated, and clear to the Duke, though he would not have put it in these terms, that being in a room with someone who disagreed with him and was consistently right was producing in him something that felt uncomfortably like genuine attention. He had opinions about legal strategy. They were not bad opinions. They were, on 2 specific points, wrong. And when she told him so the first time about the question of whether to lead with the Latin documents or hold them for rebuttal, he sat back in his chair and looked at her in a way that was not quite challenge and not quite concession, and said, "Tell me why." She told him why. He listened. He said, "All right, you're right." The second time, about whether to include the 1748 survey marker in the primary brief or use it as supplementary evidence. She disagreed before he had finished the sentence, which was not her most gracious moment, and he said, "Let me finish." "I know where you're going," Vivienne said. "If we put the survey marker in the primary brief, Crale's counsel will argue the boundary description is ambiguous and use that ambiguity to create room for the covenant. If we hold it for rebuttal, we use it to close the ambiguity after they have committed to their argument. You cannot close a door you have not opened." There was a pause. "That is exactly where I was going," the Duke said. "And you are correct that it is the wrong direction." "I know," Vivienne said, and went back to the document in front of her. He did not deflect with a joke. He made a note in the margin of his own copy and moved on. And she found this, the absence of performance, the simple acceptance, more disorienting than she had expected. The county assembly was on the 12th of November, a fortnight into the evening sessions, and Vivienne attended because she always attended, and because she was not going to let Lord Crale's legal maneuvering change her habits. The Duke was there as well, which she had not planned for, and they spoke briefly near the fireplace about a reference she had found in the morning's archive work, which was perfectly appropriate and drew no particular attention. What drew attention was a conversation she was not part of. 2 of Lord Crale's allies, a Mr. Forsyth and his brother-in-law, a man named Whittle who owned a mill 3 parishes over, made a remark near the card tables about the impropriety of a single woman receiving a duke's nightly consultations, and the particular tone in which they said consultations was designed to travel. She was not there to hear it. She was on the other side of the room discussing the drainage survey with a neighboring farmer named Grist, who had a practical knowledge of the mill pond that she found considerably more useful than most of what she had read. The Duke was standing 6 feet from Forsyth and Whittle when they said it. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression in any visible way. What he said to them, in the quiet, precise manner of a man who has never needed volume to make himself understood, was something that ended the conversation entirely and left both men looking at their cards with the focused attention of people who have decided to be somewhere else without moving. He did not mention it to Vivienne. She heard about it the next morning from Mrs. Grantham, the vicar's wife, who arrived at Ashfin ostensibly to return a borrowed book and actually to ensure that Vivienne knew everything relevant before noon. Mrs. Grantham had excellent timing and a comprehensive understanding of what constituted useful information. He told them, Mrs. Grantham said, settling into the chair across from Vivienne's desk with the book on her lap. That Miss Whitmore was conducting a legal defense of her property with the same professional rigor she brought to everything, and that if either of them had a concern about the propriety of the arrangement, they were welcome to raise it with his solicitor, who would be happy to explain the relevant legal precedents. And then he said that he had found, in his experience, that men who speculated about a woman's conduct in legal matters were generally men who had reason to prefer she not conduct them at all. Vivienne looked at the fire for a moment. He said that. In those words, Mrs. Grantham confirmed. Mr. Forsyth looked as though he had sat on something sharp. Vivienne did not thank him for it that evening when he arrived at 6 with his satchel. She waited until they had been working for an hour, and then she set down her pen and said, "You spoke to Forsyth and Whittle at the assembly." The Duke looked up from the ledger he was cross-referencing. "Someone told you." Mrs. Grantham. "Of course." He returned to the ledger. It was a brief exchange. "I did not ask you to do that," Vivienne said. "I know," he said. "Then why did you?" He set the ledger down. He looked at her directly, without the social machinery, without the performance. "I did not like the way they spoke about you," he said. "That is the only reason." Vivienne looked at him. He held her gaze without adding anything to it, without softening it or ornamenting it. And she found she had nothing to say in response that would not either thank him or argue with him, and she did not want to do either. She picked up her pen. He picked up the ledger. The rain continued against the windows, and the lamp burned steadily, and neither of them said anything more about it. The Mill Pond assessment was arranged for the 21st of November. A dawn appointment with the county surveyor, a methodical man named Crisp, who had the manner of someone who had been asked to settle a great many disputes and had survived them all by writing everything down. The frost was already on the ground when Vivienne arrived at the mill pond edge, and the Duke was there before her, which she noted without comment. They walked the boundary with Crisp for the better part of 2 hours, Vivienne pointing out the natural features that corresponded to the earliest land descriptions, and the Duke providing the Mornington Hall perspective on the eastern side of the channel. Crisp said very little, wrote a great deal, and moved ahead of them at regular intervals with his measuring rod. At the far end of the mill pond, where the stone path narrowed and the bank became slick with the combination of frost and morning damp, Vivienne stepped onto a flat stone that had looked solid and was not. Her foot went sideways. She had time to register the cold air and the fact that the pond was considerably closer than she wanted it to be before the Duke caught her hand. Not her elbow, not her sleeve, but her hand, a full grip, fingers over fingers. And she was steady. He did not let go immediately. The steadying was accomplished in the first second. What followed was 3 or 4 seconds of him holding her hand in the cold morning air, and her letting him and the surveyor 20 yards ahead, with his back to them and his measuring rod in the ground. Neither of them mentioned it. She withdrew her hand in a way that was neither abrupt nor prolonged, and they walked on, and Crisp showed them the point where the natural drainage channel divided and made a note in his book. And the morning continued as mornings do, with the frost burning off slowly and the light coming up gray and flat over the Hertfordshire fields. That evening in the library, she asked him the question she had been carrying since the assembly. "You said you did not like the way they spoke about me," Vivienne said. "But you did not know me 3 weeks ago. You came to this lane to buy my water, right? So I want to understand what changed between that morning and the assembly." The Duke considered this. He had the look of a man who was deciding how much of the truth to use. "I think," he said slowly, "that I arrived in Hertfordshire expecting to resolve a legal nuisance in a fortnight. And then I found myself at a library table with someone who was more prepared than I was, more right than I expected, and entirely uninterested in whether I was charming. And it occurred to me at the assembly that the men making that remark had never once considered what it costs to do what you are doing. They saw the situation and assumed the worst. Because assuming the worst about a woman who refuses to be manageable is the easiest way to manage her. Vivienne set down her pen. I did not want to be the kind of man who lets that pass, the Duke said. That is all. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the rain had shifted to something heavier, drumming against the stone of the house with a persistence that made the library feel sealed and particular. She picked up the document she had been annotating and read 2 lines of it and then set it down again. There is something I should tell you, she said, without looking up. All right, he said. I was engaged once. At 22. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without apology, without the softening she had watched other women apply to difficult truths. He spent a season being very attentive, very charming. He asked me a great deal about my father's estate, the acreage, the tenant arrangements, the condition of the buildings. I thought he was interested because he was interested in me. He used what I told him to negotiate a better match with a wealthier family. He was very thorough about it. The Duke said nothing. I have been right about charming men for 12 years, Vivienne said. I have had no reason to revise the verdict. And now? He said. She looked up. The lamp was between them on the table, throwing its light upward, and he was watching her with the specific quality of attention she had come to recognize over 3 weeks of evenings. Not performing interest, not deploying it strategically, but genuinely, inconveniently present. Now, she said, you are making it considerably more complicated. She reached for the next document in the stack, which I did not ask for. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, not as a joke, not as a deflection, but with the careless accuracy of a man who speaks without checking himself. Women who choose solitude because they cannot imagine a man tolerating their peculiarities at least have the comfort of the hypothesis. Vivienne put the document down. I have imagined it, she said, without any performance in it at all. Perfectly. The problem is, I could imagine tolerating his. The room went very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of 2 people working, but the other kind. The kind that has a shape to it, a weight, that both of them could feel pressing against the space between them. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. The rain hit the windows, and the lamp burned, and the stack of documents sat between them, and neither of them reached for it. At 2 a.m, she said, You should go home. He went. He rode back to Mornington Hall in the rain, stabled his horse, and went directly to the map room, which was where he went when he needed to think in a space that had no social expectations attached to it. The map room was at the back of the house, lined with estate surveys and county charts, and it smelled of old paper and the particular cold of rooms that are heated only when someone is in them. On the desk was the document he had been sitting on for 6 weeks. It was a legal analysis prepared by his London solicitor, Mr. Farwell, at his request in September, before he had ever met Vivienne Whitmore. The analysis examined Lord Crale's covenant claim and concluded, with considerable confidence, that the covenant was a forgery. The paper stock was inconsistent with documents of the period it claimed. The signature of the supposed witness did not match any known example. The covenant described a water configuration that, as far as Farwell could determine from the available records, had never existed. If this analysis was presented, Lord Crale's claim dissolved entirely. It also dissolved the Duke's strongest argument for purchasing Vivienne's water right. The argument had been simple. The water right was legally contested, its value was uncertain, and selling to him was the rational resolution. Without the legal contest, there was no pressure, no uncertainty, and no rational reason for her to sell. He had not shown it to her. He had told himself he was waiting for the right moment, and then the right moment had not arrived. And 6 weeks had passed, and they had built something in the Ashfen library that he had not expected to build with anyone. And the document was still on the desk. He sat in the map room with the fire burning down around him. And he looked at the document. And he waited for the thing he always did in moments of genuine discomfort. The joke, the deflection, the piece of wit that reframed the situation into something navigable. Nothing came. He sat with the silence and the dying fire and the document on the desk. And for the first time since he had constructed the Libertine persona at 31, as an answer to a question he could not face, the performance had entirely stopped. There was no one in the room to see what was left when it did, and he was not entirely certain he wanted to find out. He sat there until the fire went out. Vivienne did not tell the Duke about the geological survey she had commissioned from a firm in Cambridge. She had arranged it quietly, 2 weeks into the evening sessions, because she had been looking at the configuration of the mill pond and the drainage channel, and something in the Covenant's description of the water feature had struck her as geologically improbable. The survey would take 3 weeks to produce findings. She told no one about it except Mrs. Peel, who was told only that she was expecting a letter from Cambridge. She had not stopped suspecting the Duke had interests she did not fully know about. She had been right about charming men for 12 years, and she was not going to abandon the practice of independent verification simply because she could imagine tolerating his peculiarities. Those two things were not in conflict. On the 28th of November, the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Farwell, working through the counterbrief, found a reference in the Mornington Hall estate correspondence to a secondary document that should have been filed in the map room. He wrote to the Duke asking him to locate it. The Duke went to the map room. He found the withheld analysis sitting on the desk where he had left it 6 weeks ago, because he had not moved it. Because every time he went to the map room, he sat with it and then left it where it was, which was a form of decision-making he was not proud of. He sat with it again for 2 days. He drafted 3 separate letters to Vivienne and destroyed all 3. He told himself he was finding the right way to say it. And he recognized, with the specific clarity that arrives too late, that there was no right way, and that he had been using the search for one as a reason not to say anything at all. On the 1st of December, Vivienne arrived at Mornington Hall and asked to see the map room. She had been following the same archival thread independently, the reference in the county record office to a secondary document pertaining to the water boundary, and it had led her to the same place. She did not tell him why she wanted to see the map room. She said she was following a reference in the county records, wanted to check it against the Mornington Hall collection. He showed her everything. She worked through the map room in the methodical way she worked through everything, starting at the left wall and moving right, checking dates, pulling documents that fell within the relevant period, and replacing them when they did not apply. She had been working for just under an hour when she found the analysis. She read it. She read it again. She read the date at the top, the 17th of September, 6 weeks before Crale's hearing date. 4 weeks before the Duke had ridden up the lane to offer her a reasonable price for something that was not for sale. She set the document on the desk, very carefully, in the center. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her coat from the chair where she had left it and put it on. "Vivienne," he said. She did not answer. She walked out of the map room, through the hall, out the front door of Mornington Hall, and rode back to Ashford. She did not go to the Ashford library that evening, nor the following 3 evenings. His notes arrived daily, each one shorter than the last, each one more stripped of the social furniture he usually deployed. She read them and set them aside and continued her own case preparation because the hearing was in 2 weeks and she had never in her life abandoned a project because a man had disappointed her, and she was not going to start at 34. She worked through the archive alone. She prepared the counterbrief as she would have prepared it without him, using the documents they had identified together because they were real evidence, regardless of who had found them. She was not going to sabotage her own legal case because the man who had helped build it had also been managing her toward his preferred outcome. That would be punishing herself, and she had never been interested in that particular form of principle. She was furious. She was furious in the specific, cold way she was furious at things that confirmed what she had already known. The way a woman is furious when evidence arrives to validate a 12-year-old verdict, and she had been hoping, quietly, against her own better judgment, that this time the evidence would say something different. She did not weep. She went very quiet and very direct, and she worked. On the 4th day, he arrived at Ashford at 10 in the morning and asked Mrs. Peel if he might wait. Mrs. Peel, who had been with the Whitmore household for 19 years and had her own views about the situation, showed him into the entrance hall and did not offer him tea, which was a judgment she delivered without a word. He waited for 3 hours. He sat in the entrance hall on the straight-back chair beside the door, and he waited. And he did not send up a note or ask for an update. And when Vivienne came downstairs at 1 o'clock, he was still there. She stopped on the bottom step and looked at him. He stood. "I will not take long," he said. "Take whatever time you need," she said, and sat on the bottom step, which was not conventional. But she had stopped caring about conventional in the entrance hall of her own house approximately 12 years ago. He remained standing. He did not produce a speech. What he did was tell her the truth in the plainest language he had available, which was the only thing he had left that was worth anything. "I commissioned the analysis in September because I wanted to know whether Crale's claim was real," he said. "When I found out it was a forgery, I understood that presenting it would end the legal threat and end my argument for buying your water right. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I was not waiting for the right moment. I was keeping the argument open because I wanted a reason to be here." Vivienne was quiet. "I was not honest with you," he said. "Everything I did in that library was real. The work, the Latin, the arguments about legal strategy. But I was doing it alongside something I had not told you. And that means you were building an alliance with someone who was not telling you the full truth of his position. You had a right to that information from the beginning." She looked at him for a long time. He did not fill the silence. "What do you want?" she said finally. "Not from the water dispute. From this." He said, "Vivienne." Just her name, not an answer in the conventional sense. But she heard in it the thing that was underneath it. The man who had sat in his map room until the fire went out, who had ridden here and waited 3 hours in an entrance hall, who had said the thing without a joke or a deflection or a single piece of social machinery to protect himself with. She stood up from the step and crossed the entrance hall and kissed him. It surprised both of them. It surprised her because she had not planned it, and she was a woman who generally had a plan. And it surprised him because in 12 years of social navigation, he had arranged a great many things and had not arranged this. And what he did after the first surprised moment was simply kiss her back, without performance, without charm, with nothing left to hide behind. She stepped back. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything immediately, which was unusual for both of them. "The geological survey from Cambridge arrives tomorrow," she said. "I commissioned it 3 weeks ago. I did not tell you." He absorbed this. "What does it survey?" "The physical configuration of the mill pond and the drainage channel," she said, "and whether the water feature Crale's covenant describes has ever existed in the arrangement he claims." "And you think it has not?" he said. "I think the covenant describes a physical impossibility," Vivienne said. "I think a geologist will be able to say so in language a magistrate can understand." He looked at her with the expression she had seen for the first time on a muddy lane in October, the one that was new to his face, that had nothing performed in it. "You have been running your own investigation the entire time," he said. "I told you I did not fully trust that you had interests you were not disclosing," she said. "I was right." "You were right," he agreed. "I usually am," Vivienne said. "It is one of my peculiarities." The geological survey arrived the following morning. Its findings were better than she had hoped. The Cambridge geologist had determined, from soil core analysis and historical flood records, that the drainage channel described in Crale's 1761 covenant could not have existed in the configuration claimed because the underlying geology of the mill pond basin made the described water flow a physical impossibility. The channel, as described, would have required a gradient that the natural topography of the site had never supported. She read it twice. Then she sat at her desk and wrote the final section of the counterbrief herself, incorporating the geological findings in the section she had marked Vivienne Whitmore, Sole Commission. And she sent a copy to Mr. Henshaw and kept the original. She returned to the Alliance formally, on her own terms, and the final 2 weeks of case preparation began with the withheld analysis now incorporated into the counterbrief by the Duke's solicitor, and the geological survey, hers alone to deploy at the moment of her choosing. The evening sessions resumed. The Latin documents were ordered, the arguments were rehearsed, and across the library table, in the November lamplight, 2 people who had said the unsayable thing sat and worked together with the particular quality of ease that comes not from the absence of complication, but from having passed through it and found something on the other side. The county courthouse in Hertfordshire was a Georgian building of moderate dignity on the market square, and on the 4th of December it was cold enough that the breath of the gathering crowd made small clouds in the frost-sharp air. Half the county had come, which was not unusual for a water right dispute between a duke and a gentleman's daughter. The social mathematics of the situation were too interesting to miss. Lord Crale arrived with his counsel and 2 witnesses, a performance of confidence that expressed itself in the quality of his coat and the angle of his hat. He had been certain of this outcome since September, and certainty of that duration tends to settle into the posture. The Duke arrived with Mr. Farwell. Vivienne arrived with Mr. Henshaw and a leather satchel containing the geological survey and 3 copies of the counterbrief. And she sat at the respondent's table with the satchel on the floor beside her chair and her hands folded on the table in front of her. The magistrate, a man named Holt, who had been adjudicating county disputes for 22 years, called the hearing to order at 10 o'clock. Lord Crale's counsel presented the covenant. He presented it with the theatrical confidence his client had brought to the morning, unrolling it before the magistrate with the care of a man handling something precious, and described its provenance in terms that implied it had been waiting patiently for this moment since 1761. He called his first witness, who testified to the long-standing use of the mill pond by the Crale estate. He called his second witness, who testified to the same. He sat down with the expression of a man who considers the matter settled. Mr. Farwell rose for the respondents. He presented the withheld analysis, now properly documented and signed, demonstrating the inconsistencies in the covenant's paper stock and witness signature. Lord Crale's counsel objected twice. The magistrate allowed both pieces of evidence. And then Vivienne stood up. She had not been called. She was not represented as a party in her own right. She was a respondent in a joint filing, which meant Mr. Henshaw spoke for her legal interests. She stood up without being invited, with the geological survey in her hand, and addressed the magistrate directly. "Your Honor," she said, "I am Vivienne Whitmore of Ashfin. I commissioned an independent geological survey of the disputed water features 6 weeks ago. Its findings are directly relevant to the physical plausibility of the covenant Lord Crale has presented, and I would ask the court's permission to present them." Lord Crale's counsel rose immediately. "Your Honor, this woman is not a party before this court. She has no standing to address these proceedings. This is irregular, and I object to it on every available ground." The magistrate looked at Vivienne. She held his gaze without performance, without apology, with the specific quality of stillness she had when something mattered. "Your Honor," she said, "the geological survey demonstrates that the water feature described in the covenant presented by Lord Crale has never existed in the physical configuration his claim requires. This is not a matter of legal interpretation. It is a matter of physical fact. I am the person who commissioned the survey. I am the person best placed to explain its findings, and I am the person whose property the covenant purports to affect. If the court declines to hear this evidence, Lord Crale will succeed on the basis of a document that describes a physical impossibility." Magistrate Holt was quiet for a moment. He had been adjudicating county disputes for 22 years, and he had not had a woman address his court before, and he was deciding something that was not strictly a legal question. "I will hear the survey," he said. "You may proceed, Miss Whitmore." She spoke for 6 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She described the geological findings in plain language, the soil core analysis, the historical flood records, the gradient calculations. And she explained, with the precision of someone who had read the survey 4 times and understood every word of it, why the drainage channel described in Crale's covenant could not have existed in the configuration claimed. She described what would have been required of the natural topography to make the covenant's description physically accurate. She described what the actual topography of the Mill Pond Basin showed instead. She said at the end, "The covenant Lord Crale has presented describes a water feature that has never existed. It cannot be a record of historical use because the physical configuration it describes is a geological impossibility on this site. It is not a historical document. It is a fabrication." Lord Crale's counsel objected again. The magistrate did not look at him. "The covenant," Magistrate Holt said, "is dismissed. Lord Crale's claim is dismissed in its entirety. Costs to the respondents." The steps of the courthouse in early December frost were cold and bright, and half the county was watching. And Lord Crale descended them with the expression of a man who had been deflated rather than defeated, which was worse in its way. His counsel followed him. His witnesses followed his counsel. None of them looked at Vivienne. She stood at the top of the steps with Mr. Henshaw beside her, the leather satchel in her hand, and the frost sharp in her lungs, and she felt the particular quality of relief that comes not from safety, but from having done the thing you came to do. The Duke came and stood beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen for the first time in a muddy lane in October. New to his face, nothing performed in it, and she understood that he had watched her stand up uninvited in a county courthouse and dismantle a forgery she had never been supposed to understand. and that something in him had settled into a new arrangement, permanent and unannounced. "You did not tell me about the geological survey," he said. "No," she agreed. "You were right not to." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the crowd was beginning to move. Conversations breaking open in the cold air, the social machinery of the county reassembling itself around a new set of facts. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at her. "Since October," he said, "I have been telling you pieces of the truth and withholding others, and calling it strategy. And I think you have known for a long time that that was what I was doing." He paused. "What I have not told you, because I did not know how to say it without a performance attached to it, is that I have not been in a room with anyone who made me want to stop performing in 12 years. I did not know what remained when I did. I think I was afraid of what remained. And I think what remained was the man who sat in your entrance hall for 3 hours and could not think of a single useful or funny thing to say. And that man is the only honest thing I have to offer you." Vivienne looked at him in the December frost, with the half-county watching and the courthouse steps cold under her boots and the leather satchel in her hand. "I have one question," she said. "Ask it," he said. "Are you finished managing outcomes you are afraid of?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I am finished." She considered him for a moment. The man who had waited 3 hours in an entrance hall, who had accepted being wrong without deflection, who had said her name in an entrance hall and meant everything by it. The man who was standing on courthouse steps in December frost with nothing left to perform and was still there. "Come to the Ashfin Library tonight," she said. "Not as the Duke, not as the Libertine. Come as yourself." "I will," he said. He came at 7. Mrs. Peel opened the door and showed him in without comment, did not take his hat, which he left on the table in the entrance hall and then picked up again when he followed her into the library. The fire was lit. The case documents were stacked in the corner, finished with "done," a completed thing. The table where they had spent 6 weeks of evenings was clear of everything except 2 glasses and a bottle of wine that Vivienne had opened and left to breathe. She poured both glasses and handed him one, and they sat down across from each other at the same table where they had begun, with no legal briefs between them and no Latin documents and no counter-brief and no pretense of any kind. "You read Latin," she said. "I do," he said. "That was the first useful thing I knew about you," she said. "And now?" he said. She looked at him across the table in the firelight. The man without the performance. The man who had been afraid of what remained when it stopped. The man who had turned out to be someone she could imagine tolerating, and more than that, someone she could imagine choosing. Freely, for the first time. "Now," she said, "I know considerably more." The candle on the table burned low between them. The fire settled. The wine was good. Outside, the December frost was hard on the Hertfordshire fields, and inside the Ashfin Library, 2 people who had argued over Latin and water rights and legal strategy sat across from each other with nothing left to negotiate and no particular reason to hurry. The next morning, 2 cups sat on the library table. The fire was ash. And on the finished stack of case documents, the counter-brief, the geological survey, the withheld analysis, the complete record of 6 weeks of evening work, his hat rested on top, placed there deliberately, not forgotten. He had left it on purpose. She saw it when she came downstairs, and she left it where it was,